Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. We are on day 86 of self-quarantine. And for those of you who've been listening to the show over the last several weeks, you know that I have been in Arizona staying at my grandparents' home. My grandparents passed away a few years ago, and we are grateful to be able to come to this space, with our family, to take better care of family members in particular. And I have been here really in shock over the last few days, because as of right now, right this very moment, we are under evacuation notice. Just a couple of blocks away from this home, all of the homes are evacuating because there is a wildfire that is spreading throughout the mountains that are just a couple of miles away. In the last couple of days, I have seen so many different types of wildlife go into the backyard, into the front, from javelinas to coyotes to wild lions. It's definitely climate change, and this is due to the soaring temperatures. It's unfortunately not the first evacuation I've had to deal with in my lifetime, or even in the last 10 years, because of climate change. I was in Greece just a couple of years ago, and they had their worst wildfire in history that killed hundreds of lives and became a national political story that arguably changed governments in Greece. I was there evacuating. I was in New York during Sandy, living on the Lower East Side, and was evacuated from my home because we didn't have power or water. And so many people have not been able to recover from Sandy since then. So here I am in the last decade. Those are just a few situations off the top of my head. Here I am in this home, ready for evacuation, but the show must go on because the world is actually on fire. We have global uprisings. There is momentous shift happening in our politics, and it's hard to keep up. It's hard for all of us to keep up. News is really happening so quickly, and I think a lot of folks are missing news that probably would be on the prime time, like fires here, because there is other news that is monumental and global in scale. So while we deal with COVID, while I'm in Arizona, which is now also the epicenter of COVID, because the Governor Ducey decided to open up business prematurely against expert advice, we now see a rise in COVID rates. Hospitals are over capacity, and there is a fire outside of my window. Not to mention the protests that continue, the protests over police brutality, the protests over austerity that has hurt so many communities of color and people on the front lines and indigenous people. These protests are a symbol of a failed system of capitalist-led government. But today's show is about the future. Today's show is what we do right now with what we have, how we take over our government so that we are never in this situation again as a collective. Today's show is about what it means to elect leaders that have the courage to stand up and to voice outrage and have actual plans that are going to shift policies so that we deal with climate change head on as an emergency, because it is literally an emergency right now as I sit here. Today's show is not about reform. Today's show is not about passing legislation to hold bad actors accountable. Today's show is about what it means to drastically shift our government because we have no choice at this point. Today's show is about democracy. Our democracy is eroding. We have elections that we, as the United States, would mock other countries for. Our elections in our own states are not being conducted fairly with proper oversight. What happens in the United States, of course, has a global effect. We are seeing it on the streets. We are seeing how the Black Lives Movement has turned into a global movement. There are streets across Europe being flooded with people standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter America and against colonialism. But this show is also about silence and courage. I've noticed something in the last couple of years from progressive leaders, and I want to talk about it head on. And I have been guilty myself. If we want to have more progressives in Congress and in elected office, we must fundamentally understand the challenges that they face, especially if they're women, especially if they're women of color. We need to understand the systemic issues that they face in their real lives, the sacrifices they are making when they are running for office, and the added challenges that they're facing while they're running for Congress. So what does that mean? That means if you decide that you want to run for office and you come from a working class background, my guess is you do not have a bunch of rich friends that you can call up for maxed out checks to get your campaign up and off the ground. My guess is that you're not going to have institutions swoop in and help you raise the money or get you the press. My guess is the press isn't even going to cover you. Maybe ever, but definitely not before you get some big endorsements. Meanwhile, so many of these people who are courageously stepping up and running for office are doing so without taking work or cutting back on work or still working. They're not paying their student loans. They're not paying their car bills, their insurance bills. They're defaulting. They're not paying their mortgages if they're so lucky to have mortgages. They are going into debt as they courageously step up and run for office with very little assistance, with so much to prove, all for us. But we have to think about, there are people in office right now who are very lonely, progressives in office that are very lonely, and they become more powerful if they have allies in Congress with them, in the Senate with them, in the city council with them. People who are not just branded progressives, but people who don't take the corporate money, don't take the police union money, don't vote for the police union budgets, don't vote for the military industrial complex expanding their powers and their bank accounts. It is a very lonely place to be in government right now if you are a true progressive, and you only become a stronger progressive if there are other progressives there to back you up. But that means we as a collective have a duty to support these candidates earlier. The litmus tests that the institutions put out there are always based on fundraising. Have you raised $300,000 in the first 2 months? Oh, you haven't? We can't support you. That's the establishment. But I'm hearing similar style litmus tests about seeing whether or not a candidate is viable. What does that mean? What does viability mean? Doesn't the candidate become more viable if they get that support earlier? So I am challenging everyone, not just those in office, not just big leaders, not just organizations. I'm challenging everybody to support these candidates, especially if they don't have all the money flowing, and support them early. Because the sooner they can get up and off the ground as candidates, the stronger their campaigns become. The earlier people learn about them, they can get their name out there, their ideas out there. And if they're not in COVID, they can knock on doors. But if these endorsements are coming in late like I am seeing right now, and thank goodness there are progressives endorsing. I do not want to discredit that. I think it's commendable that people are using their leadership to go out there and endorse other leaders. But we can do better. The earlier you endorse, that candidate, that campaign can fund more staff, can put out more materials, can possibly quit their job and do it full time. The earlier that they receive a flood of money, the way that so many progressives have seen in the last few years, those small dollar donations, the earlier that that happens, the stronger the campaign. Because a lot of it is flooding in at the end, if it's flooding in at the end, when the endorsements roll in, when the press starts to come. But it might not be enough, because the establishment has their money the whole time. The establishment has the press the whole time. And the more times the establishment's name is said over and over and hits a home with a mail piece or an advertisement, that name is more familiar to the voter. So the earlier people learn about the progressive, which costs some money, the more that progressive challenges the establishment. So my lesson for today is ask your progressive leaders who are elected to endorse early. I understand it's politics. I understand there's a lot of dynamics and folks sometimes can't do it early for a reason, but I also want to give shout outs to people like Representative Ro Khanna. He endorses early. Marianne Williamson endorses early. This is the kind of leadership that we need. And we should be endorsing candidates that really need that help at a critical moment. And for you guys looking to give money, I also urge you to support candidates who may not be getting the national love. I'm not saying that everybody doesn't deserve small dollar donations and support, and some of these races are super tight, especially in the end. But don't forget the folks out there who may not be getting the coalition support. And when I say coalition, I mean organizations will come out and support a candidate at some point, and then another organization will, and then they'll pitch press, and then elected officials will come out and endorse, and that is fantastic, and that is how we win. But I urge you guys to please support candidates who really need the love right now. It's been a hard road. Some of these candidates have been running for 16 months or more. Some of them haven't worked. They're going into debt, and they did not expect COVID to come in. They expected to have strong door-to-door elections and campaigns, and now it's going to be very hard. Now something could happen. I mean, listen, an uprising took place in less than a week. The world can shift, politics can shift so quickly. But the way that we need to deal with the climate emergency is the way that we need to deal with supporting our progressives courageously running right now. To deal with these crises, we need people who understand the crisis of survival in office, to articulate that, to vote that way, to say and reject oil money and military industrial complex money, war money, police union money, to go bolder, not call for reform, but transformational change. We need people who know what it feels like to have their friends and family locked up for no reason at all. We need people who know what it feels like to not be able to afford to go to college or go broke as a result. We need people who know what it feels like to be denied health care, medical care, because they can't afford to get something treated. We need people who know what it feels like to not be able to pay rent, to be homeless. These are Americans. These are the crises that are in front of us. We need people that know these crises firsthand to go in there and fight for us in Congress. But that means we have to support them. It's all a crisis now. It's all hands on deck. You are listening and watching The Nomiki Show. Make sure to click subscribe and like and share to get those alerts on YouTube. And if you are not already, please join us on Patreon. It's our patrons who make this show happen. We are an independent media channel. What that means is that we don't have corporate stakeholders pushing us through the algorithms. We're not getting the likes and shares through bots. You guys are what makes the show function. So please, we invite you to join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show.